Man, RareWare games were so good. For a solid 15 years, starting from the late 80s, there were few other studios able to accomplish what Rare was able to do. Regardless of what your first console was, if you were gaming at the time, chances are there was a Rare game that earned a lot of your love. I feel like they've been talked about a lot, but Rare was founded by the two brothers, Tim and Chris Stamper. They started off messing around in the arcade systems, but it wasn't until they decided to reverse engineer the Nintendo Entertainment System and almost entirely shift their focus towards console development that the brothers actually founded Rare. You might be wondering, why would they reverse engineer the Nintendo Entertainment System? Well, it's actually because Nintendo said it was impossible. So these two brothers took it as a personal challenge to see if they can figure it out. And they ended up making some tech demos out of it too. Took those tech demos over to a Nintendo executive in Kyoto, and the Japanese company was so impressed that they granted them an unlimited budget to work on NES games, which in and of itself is already so impressive. It was obviously a very different time. I mean, right now if you were to reverse engineer one of Nintendo's consoles, I'm guessing they wouldn't really be as pleasant. But no, in this case, it actually worked out for everybody, because Rare ended up making roughly 60 games over a 5-year period, and 47 of those were on the NES. Now, in fairness, for a lot of these games, Rare was not working alone. They teamed up with Acclaim, Electronic Arts, even Sega. Actually, of the games that didn't make it towards the NES, some of them were just straight up conversions onto the Sega Genesis or to the Game Boy. And these games differed drastically. There was so much diversity in the library of what they were doing. Games like RC Pro-Am, Wheel of Fortune, WWF WrestleMania, Sesame Street, ABC, The Amazing Spider-Man, and even Who Framed Roger Rabbit. These were games spanning off of so many different types of genres as well as various different publishers, but they were all, at least in part, developed by the Rare team. But it wasn't until the early 90s where they started to streamline their focus. With the release of BattleToads on the NES, the Game Boy, the Amiga, and even the Mega Drive, they found a beat-em-up franchise that they really clicked with. Now, these BattleToads games were published by TradeWest. They were notorious for their difficulty, but they were popular, they were selling well. So TradeWest told Rare to make a crap ton of sequels. And in addition to that, gave their own Double Dragon license straight to Rare, allowing them to make a crossover game between the two franchises. And that confidence paid off and took the company straight into the next generation of the Super Nintendo. Now, when they got to the Super Nintendo, Rare decided to pump the brakes a little bit instead of jumping right into things. They had made a lot of money during the NES era and decided to reinvest that into their company. And they decided to buy the Silicon Graphics workstation, allowing them to make 3D models, which made them one of the most technologically advanced developers, giving them a high status in the international market. And in doing so, Rare decided to focus more now on quality instead of quantity. They showed the goods off to Nintendo, dangled their pre-rendered models in front of the giant, more or less giving them no other choice than to buy out a 25% stake in the company, which would gradually increase to 49%, making them officially a second-party developer for Nintendo. But regardless of that, they still operated independently, being able to flex their creative muscles with no significant involvement from Nintendo. And throughout all of this, Nintendo offered Rare a catalog of characters, prompting the Stamper Brothers to ask for Donkey Kong, leading us to Donkey Kong Country. Now, BattleToads, late 80s, NES, I may have dabbled in some of those games here and there, but I don't have too many memories or nostalgia for those games. Donkey Kong Country, on the other hand, yeah, that's a whole different story. Donkey Kong Country wasn't necessarily the first game that I played, but it was the first game that I went out of my way to choose and put into the Super Nintendo when I was about 4 years old. Prior to that, I was just given a controller when I was hanging out with the family. You can hear more about that in my Donkey Kong Country retrospective that I released back in January. Now, keep in mind, when Donkey Kong came into the mixture, there was a shift starting in the industry. Mario was the platformer through the late 80s and going into the early 90s. If you played a 2D platformer, you played Mario. You bought yourself a Nintendo or a Super Nintendo and you played Mario. That's how it worked. But shortly after that, Sonic became popular. And going into the early 90s, Nintendo was challenged, and they were challenged hard. In contrast to this happy-go-lucky plumber, you had a blue hedgehog with attitude convincing kids all throughout the playgrounds that he was the better choice if you were a cool dude. And Sega was making a hell of a splash because of the hedgehog. So if Donkey Kong was going to enter the discussion of a 2D platformer, they had to nail it. And damn did they nail it. They managed to improve on almost every cool thing you can think of from the Mario franchise as well as the Sonic series. Sonic had Tails following him around, so Donkey Kong had Diddy following him around. But you can also switch and use Diddy if you wanted to, and Diddy was sometimes more fun to use. Mario had Yoshi as a rideable buddy, well, they gave you Rambi the Rhino, as well as a whole team of animal buddies to help you out. Sonic found a way to drastically improve on the backgrounds and visuals, the music and the ambiance, using the advanced technology of the Sega Genesis than what Nintendo was able to accomplish on the NES and on the early Super Nintendo days. Well, Donkey Kong Country had 3D models turned to sprites, stages that would evolve as you go through them, and the most incredible ambiance you could have imagined for the time, made to feel all the more immersive with the music of David Wise. I love this guy. I mean, you guys probably already figured that out because 90% of the time, his music is the background tune for my video. But Rare knocked it out of the park with Donkey Kong Country. And its sequel. I'd argue the third one was really good too, but it took a very long time for people to start appreciating that one. Now, throughout all of this, they were also making Killer Instinct in the arcade machines for Midway, which they actually ported over to the Super Nintendo, as well as some Donkey Kong Game Boy ports, and a Ken Griffey Jr. game. I didn't even know about that one. And that pretty much carried them over to the Nintendo 64, seeing a whole lot of success not only for Donkey Kong, but for Killer Instinct, which sold over 3 million copies. The team had to expand their headquarters. They went up to roughly 250 staff members, and then their first showing on the Nintendo 64 came in 1997 with Blast Corps. Now, Blast Corps sold 1 million copies. It could be fun, but by Rare's own standards, they considered it a disappointment. But by this point in time, Rare was large enough to have multiple different teams working on different projects. Rare was working on a 3D platformer to be their main IP for the Nintendo 64, but that was being delayed. So they started to push out their small projects. The ones that probably won't do that well. The ones that were just quick cash grabs because of some licensed property. With a multiplayer mode shoehorned in because, why not? You know, just 007 GoldenEye, no big deal. I don't know what I could tell you. Either you were there and you know how phenomenal this was, or you've heard about its impact on console first-person shooters. For a lot of people, this was the multiplayer game. Almost everybody I know that had this game had a single stage that they would always choose over and over again. I don't know why. It's like you have a game with a ton of different maps and different options and you can mix it up a little bit, but in our case, it was complex. This was basically our default stage. Anytime we picked it, we would enjoy it. And if we kept playing for too long, we'd pick another stage. What's the big deal? We'd also go through phases. Either we picked rockets or proximity mines or remote mines. Grenade launchers were fun as hell to get them to bounce off the wall and land where you want them to land. And then there were certain maps that we enjoyed specific modes for. Like for some reason, we only played the man with the golden gun in facility. Did anybody else do that? These were just kind of crazy house rules that we had. It was always my two brothers and I, and then anytime we had a friend or cousin join in, we'd have 4 players. And in the natural way of things, if we had more than 4 people, the loser would always have to give it up. If you had 2 people waiting, 2 people give it up. If you have 3 people waiting, 3 people give it up. And it's funny because it wasn't even until I got way older until I realized people had an issue with screen looking. Like, yeah, you're playing split screen. Part of the skill is being able to look at somebody else's screen while also running around yourself and figuring out where they are. It creates a bit of a chess match because you know where you're going and the guy you're playing against knows where you're going, but you also know where they're going, and then now it's just all this psychological crap going on until one of you explodes because you walk into a proximity mine that you set 10 minutes ago and didn't remember. When I got older and started seeing people whining about screen looking and seeing all of the lengths they would go to make sure that you couldn't see the opposite person's screen, I thought it was dumb as hell. But yeah, this game was dope, and when they ported it over to the Xbox Series X and included widescreen support and twin stick controls, I still think it's fun as hell, and we've spent so many hours revisiting this one. Now, later on, in that same year of 1997, you'd think with how phenomenal GoldenEye was and how much of a lasting legacy it has, that would be the only massive title that would be released, but nope. Later on in that year, we got Diddy Kong Racing. Now, if I am not mistaken, Diddy Kong Racing was the first game that was actually published by Rare. Up to that point, they were always developing for a different publisher. But here they had a racer with a ton of their own original characters, And it's not just a regular kart racer. You had cars, airplanes, and hovercrafts. And it's all wrapped up with an amazing single-player adventure mode. In a lot of cases for games like this, it feels like the multiplayer is the primary focus, and then they just kind of shoehorn in an included single-player mode just to keep you happy a little bit. But no, this is like a legit story mode, and I would actually recommend finding a way to play it. It's a lot of fun. The multiplayer is cool too, and it is fun to revisit, but it's kind of like revisiting Mario Kart 64. These kart racers have evolved so much over time that unless you have a ton of nostalgia for it, you're probably better off just sticking with the modern ones. But outside of something like, I don't know, Crash Team Racing, I don't think we've seen this type of love and effort being put into a single player mode in a kart racer. I mean, Mario Kart DS had a mission mode, and I mean, don't get me wrong, I love that mission mode that was in Mario Kart DS, but that's nothing in comparison. We were just so starved for that type of single player experience in a Mario Kart game since the DS, and as a result, I think we've over-glorified it. But Diddy Kong Racing? No, grab your favorite emulator and get on that one. Especially because within the following 2 years, 2 of the characters that were in Diddy Kong Racing would get their own game. In 1998, we got Banjo and Kazooie, and in 1999, we got Conker's Pocket Tales, a very family-friendly Game Boy Color game featuring everybody's favorite happy-go-lucky squirrel. Yeah, let's hold off on Conker a bit and backpedal. Go back to Banjo. So, Banjo, you guys all know him. I don't know about anybody else, but for me, Banjo and Kazooie felt like the true transition to 3D from Donkey Kong Country into the Nintendo 64. Now, obviously, we would get DK64 later, but I've always viewed the Rare quartet of Banjo-Tooie, DK64, and Conker's Bad Fur Day as one giant series. When you jump between the games, they feel eerily similar. The vibes, the art style, the music, the models. I mean, consider that Banjo-Kazooie was just some giant collectathon, right? For many people, they took Mario 64 and they made it better, which I find to be blasphemy, but fine, whatever. If anybody feels that way, I completely understand it. It's Banjo and Kazooie. It's an amazing game. And then the next year, Donkey Kong 64 comes out, and it's just like collectathon, but even more. 5 characters. Everybody's got their own unique collectible. And not just that, in order to switch characters, you gotta go to a specific location, so throughout most of this game, you find yourself running down a tunnel, and then running back to switch characters, and then running back again. This game is a pain in the butt to fully complete. I've done it once, a very long time ago, when I had plenty of more time, and I will never do it again the traditional way. But what I will do, and what I will eventually probably do for this channel actually, is play it with the Tag Anywhere ROM hack. It's a pretty good ROM hack that allows you to switch over to any Kong you want by hitting one of the buttons on the D-pad. Strangely enough, as a kid, you know, a lot more innocent back then, I didn't find the whole idea of having to collect every collectible with each individual Kong to be that cumbersome. Like, it just felt like it was part of the challenge. I never really saw it as padding because every game had padding back then. But if you're somebody that's been wanting to play DK64 and just couldn't really stomach the idea of collecting everything in there, I'd actually not only suggest doing the Tag Anywhere hack, I would suggest going in there, doing the Tag Anywhere hack, and then just trying to beat the game one time through, not necessarily going for full completion. That could very easily change your perception of the game. It's kind of like the blue coins in Mario Sunshine, for example. If you are adamant about going for full completion of Mario Sunshine, you could really sour the taste of the experience. But if you just play it through, start to end, and try to beat the game, it's not too bad. And then if you'd like to, you can go for the full completion. The problem is with DK64, if you're just trying to beat it one time through without the Tag Anywhere hack, just doing that alone could drive you mad. So that's why I would recommend doing the ROM hack, and just play it start to end. Don't let those counters bother you. It's a very fun 3D platformer if you do it that way. And if you find that you're having a phenomenal time, that's when you can start going for full completion. Now, rounding out 1999, they had Mickey's Racing Adventure for the Game Boy Color, but they also had Jet Force Gemini for the Nintendo 64, a third-person shooter. This is another one that I think was really fun for the time. I don't know if it got as popular as it probably deserved to get, but I also know that I have not revisited this game in over 20 years, so maybe it was as popular as it should be. Well, there's a massive Jet Force Gemini cult following. I'm not particularly part of it, but it was a quality game. And that would take us to the year 2000, the year of Perfect Dark. Remember GoldenEye? Take that, make it bigger, make it better, make it more advanced, make it published by Rare, and watch everybody eat it right up as another phenomenal shooter for the Nintendo 64. I can say without a shadow of a doubt that Perfect Dark is probably the better game than GoldenEye. I think based off of everything I've seen and heard about it over the past 20 years, it's hard to argue. With that being said, I've only ever played it once, and I think GoldenEye has the lasting legacy over it. But based off of everything that I've heard from people that do love and enjoy this title, it was a better version of GoldenEye. Now, Perfect Dark also got a Game Boy Color port. I'm calling it a port, but it was definitely not a port. It was a Game Boy Color game, and what you would expect at the time. But Donkey Kong Land 3 from the Game Boy actually did get a Game Boy Color version, making it one of the more enjoyable Donkey Kong Land games to revisit because it has that Game Boy Color version. Unless, you get a colorized ROM hack of the first two titles as well. And we would also get Mickey Speedway USA, the other Rare kart racer on the Nintendo 64, and another game that I have never played, nor do I actually know if it's any good or not. I have read some people say this online, and they're very brave to say this online, that Mickey Speedway USA is the best of the three kart racers for the Nintendo 64. They felt as though it took everything from Diddy Kong Racing and improved upon it, more or less perfecting what they started with DKR. But I've tried to play this so many times with my friends and nobody ever wants to play it. So yeah, that's kind of unfortunate. Maybe if it was released earlier in the console's life cycle, it would have been more appreciated. But in fairness, I don't know too many people that say it's a bad game. I just know a lot of people that say they never played it. Unlike the next two games that would round out the Nintendo 64 experience for Rare, Banjo-Tooie and Conker's Bad Fur Day. Okay, so first off, Banjo-Tooie is like Banjo-Kazooie but on crack. Not quite DK64 levels of crack because that one had a lot of backtracking with the specific stuff, but close to it. I think there is a fair argument that Tooie might actually be the better game, but it's not an argument that I'm willing to make. Not yet, at least. I think I've mentioned it a few times already, but I do plan on making retrospectives on the Banjo games as well as Donkey Kong 64 and Conker's Bad Fur Day, and that should be my next major project that I'll probably get started on by the end of June. So hopefully by the end of that series, I'll have a better idea for how I feel about these games. But honestly, I just like Tooie a lot because it was just more Banjo, so it was more of a chance for me to enjoy the game. Conker, on the other hand, is a whole different animal, quite literally. I never actually bought this game. By this point, I was mostly playing Sega Dreamcast, but I had a friend who was an only child, and apparently his dad thought it was appropriate for him to have a mature rated game when he was only 10 years old. So I'd go to his house and we would play the heck out of Conker's Bad Fur Day. Now, I never actually played the single player mode, we would just play the multiplayer mode over and over again. So I knew it was raunchy, but I just didn't quite realize how raunchy it was since we were mostly focused on the Nazi teddies fighting against the squirrels with chainsaws, or using dinosaurs to eat the cavemen, or that one stage where you could pee on each other in the bathroom. Yeah. I did eventually beat the single player mode of Conker, but it wasn't in Bad's Fur Day, it was in Live and Reloaded when it came out for the Xbox. Now, funnily enough for that game, I was kind of bummed out that the multiplayer mode was not the same as it was on the Nintendo 64, because that's what I was looking forward to, but I did end up loving that game a lot. And this is random, but I think it was actually the first game where I would jump on an online forum and keep track with the gaming community as we got closer and closer to its release. I had never done that before with any other game. Also, I think they had leadership charts at one point, and I was close to first place at the time for Xbox Live, but yeah, that probably lasted like an hour tops. Either way, I like Conker a lot, not just for the actual mature side of things. There were a lot of fun references to different movies around that era in addition to all the raunchy stuff. If I remember correctly, I didn't like how quickly the game ended, but the way it opened up, the way it started, felt a lot more like a typical Rare Nintendo 64 title, which just gives me so many happy memories. But yeah, when I eventually do this series, I will cover Conker. I don't know how I'm going to cover it because I tend to keep this family friendly, so we'll see. But as far as I was concerned, that was basically the end of Rare for me. Conker Live and Reloaded was on the Xbox. I already said that. And it's because by that point, Rare had been sold to Microsoft from Nintendo. They made Star Fox Adventures on GameCube, which was initially going to be a game called Dinosaur Planet, but they slapped Star Fox face on it, even though our furry friend was not supposed to be in an action platformer. But I've heard pretty mixed reviews on this one. I don't know if people just don't like it because it shouldn't be Star Fox, or if it's actually not that good of a game. I guess I will find out one day when I do decide to cover the Star Fox franchise. And then you had some fun games that were okay on the Xbox and the Xbox 360, but they never quite made the same impact or splash that they did on Nintendo 64. Grab by the Ghoulies was a decent-ish Xbox beat 'em up, but nothing I ever sank more than 20 minutes into. Banjo Pilot, I mean, if that's what you bought on the Game Boy Advance, I'm sure you enjoyed it. Cameo, Perfect Dark Zero, Viva Pinata. I mean, these were pretty big games on the Xbox 360. They weren't like the biggest games, but they were popular. I'll tell you what wasn't: Banjo and Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. Now, I'm not gonna waste too much time talking about anything from this era, but Banjo and Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, it's more offensive to me that they called this a banjo game than the actual game itself. I think similar to Star Fox Adventure not really being a Star Fox game, this does not feel like an actual banjo game. But yeah, outside of that, it's a lot of ports, a lot of Connect games, a few re-releases or remasters, all of various degrees of popularity and success, but nothing quite as Rare was during its time when it was owned by Nintendo. Although Sea of Thieves got pretty close, but that game deserves its own discussion. It's just so far and away removed from the feeling that the 90s Rare used to give you, which, I mean, it should. It came out near 20 years later. Now, I know there's a lot more politics behind this, right? Companies have shakeups, people come and go. It's not an uncommon practice in the industry. But if you're, 10 to 13 or 15 years old around the time that Microsoft buys Rare, you don't really look at the intricacies. In your mind, this is Rare. This is the company that made all of these phenomenal experiences that you've enjoyed over the past decade or so. And with a snap of a finger, they're no longer part of Nintendo. I mean, Donkey Kong stayed, but it took until Retro Studios to pick him back up to the glory that he once was. Banjo was gone, and there was no 3D platformer that felt like it truly replaced what that brought to the table. When we got to the GameCube, we got our new Zelda, we got our new Mario, but we didn't get our new 3D Donkey Kong. We didn't get our new Banjo game. We obviously didn't get Conker as well, but by that point Nintendo had cleaned up its act, so there was no way Conker was going to come back. It felt really sad for a while. We hadn't seen Diddy Kong in anything in years because Nintendo wouldn't put him anywhere until a few years later. Banjo wasn't in Smash even though we felt like he belonged there with his brethren, and it took so long to finally get him in Smash Brothers. But Banjo should have been there in Smash Bros. 64, and if not, then definitely in Melee. Heck, even as a kid, I remember thinking if only Nintendo still had Rare, they would have a great console shooter to keep up with all these other console shooters. Because in my little brain, I thought since they did GoldenEye, they'd be able to do something that matches Halo, for example. Retro Studios made Metroid in 3D good. Imagine if Rare took Metroid and made it multiplayer. That's kind of what I was thinking. Now, throughout time, various members of the Rare team have left and made games that were spiritual successors to some of the actual Rare titles that we've experienced, and a lot of those games are very fun with their mixed levels of success. But I don't know, it just never quite hit me the same way. And as pathetic as it is to say this, I don't think I ever actually got over this. Anytime I ever think about how he went through the GameCube and the Wii and the Wii U and then the Switch without Rare, and not the current Xbox iteration of Rare, I mean the old iteration of Rare, the Nintendo Rare, I get a little sad. I feel like we missed out on some games that would have been phenomenal. But I'm never opposed to going back in time and playing old games that I grew up with. That's kind of my thing. What's that saying? Don't cry because it's gone, smile because you had it at one point. Yeah, that's how I feel about Banjo on the Nintendo 64. It was truly the best of times. And I don't want to say that my nostalgia was better than your nostalgia, but I love what I have in my nostalgia, so I'm thoroughly content with my video game upbringing. In any case, I just really wanted to do this journey through the RareWare titles and my experience with a few of the titles. Depending on how this goes, maybe I'll do something similar for some other publishers or franchises. Instead of just whining about Nintendo and the gaming industry every single day, I figure a few of these videos could be a nice little break from reality. If you guys enjoy this, let me know. I'll do more of them. I have a lot of games that I would love to talk about, but unfortunately, not so much time available to play them. Not to the extent I would like to for a proper in-depth retrospective anyway. So these little bite-sized discussions might be a good way to kind of balance the best of both worlds, at least until I have more time to fully get into the titles. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this journey through Rare. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.